Have you ever really thought about what's going on in your head when you're deep into a video game? When you're totally in the zone? Well, it's way more than just quick reflexes and chasing high scores. We're talking about real, measurable, physical changes to your brain. So today, we're going to dive into the incredible science of how gaming literally reshapes our minds.
First off, just to get a sense of the sheer scale we're talking about here, check out this number, 3 billion. That's how many hours people around the world spend playing video games every single week. That is a staggering amount of collective brain power being focused on one activity.
And this isn't some fringe hobby either. Just in the United States, you've got over 150 million people who are regular gamers. We're talking folks who play at least 3 hours a week. Let's be real, it's not a subculture anymore, it's just culture.
Which, of course, brings us to the million-dollar question. With so many people spending so much time gaming, what is it actually doing to our brains? Well, the answer is a lot more complex and, honestly, a lot more fascinating than you might think.
So, let's start by busting a common myth. Who is the typical gamer? If you're picturing a teenager glued to a screen in their parents' basement, well, that's a little outdated. The data actually shows that the average American gamer is a 35-year-old adult. This is definitely not just for kids anymore.
So what's really happening inside the heads of all these people? Well, a huge review that looked at over 100 different scientific studies came to a pretty wild conclusion. Playing video games physically alters the brain. We're talking significant, measurable changes to both its structure and how it functions. And these changes basically fall into two big categories. You can think of it like upgrading a computer. On one hand, you have structural changes. That's like the physical hardware. We're seeing certain parts of the brain actually grow in size or become better connected. Then you have functional changes. That's the software. The brain itself becomes more efficient, getting better and faster at certain tasks. But, and this is a really important but, these changes aren't all positive. The research makes it pretty clear that gaming is a real double-edged sword. It offers some pretty powerful cognitive benefits, for sure, but it also comes with some very real risks.
All right, let's start with the good stuff. Gamers consistently show some serious upgrades in the attention department. This means they're not only better at focusing for long stretches, but they're also pros at tuning out distractions. In fact, their brains literally have to work less hard to stay focused. And on top of that, studies show the part of the brain responsible for memory, the right hippocampus, can actually increase in size. Plus, gamers get a major boost in something called visuospatial skills.
So what on earth are visuospatial skills? Well, think of it like your brain's built-in GPS and 3D modeling software. It's the skill that lets you mentally rotate objects, like figuring out how to fit all your luggage in the trunk, or being able to navigate a new city just by glancing at a map. And in this arena, gamers just seem to have a leg up.
Okay, so now let's look at the other side of that sword. Researchers have actually identified a condition they call internet gaming disorder. For a small number of players, what starts as a fun hobby can spiral into a genuine behavioral addiction.
And the brain scans really tell the story here. In people with gaming disorder, scientists see changes to the brain's reward system, both in its structure and its function. And what's really striking is that these are the same kinds of changes they see in other documented addictions. It seems the brain can get hooked on that dopamine hit from winning a game, just like it can with anything else.
This all leads us to this massive debate that's happening right now in the scientific community. You've all seen the ads for so-called brain training games that promise to make you smarter, right? But is there any truth to it, or is it all just clever marketing?
So on one side of the argument, you have the skeptics. They basically say, sure, you might get really good at that one specific brain game, but does that skill actually transfer to anything in the real world? Scientists call this far transfer, and the skeptics argue there's very little evidence for it. In other words, getting a high score on a digital puzzle probably isn't going to help you remember where you left your car keys. And this really gets to the heart of it. You have the skeptics saying game skills are just too narrow, but then on the other side there's a growing pile of evidence suggesting that certain kinds of games, we're talking complex 3D and strategy games, really can create lasting, measurable improvements in our cognitive abilities. And this is where it gets really cool. A groundbreaking study led by a neuroscientist named Dr. Adam Gazzaley at UCSF produced some results that were, well, they were frankly unbelievable, and they gave a lot of firepower to the hope side of this debate. So get this, they took a group of older adults, aged 60 to 85, and had them play a specially designed 3D video game for just 12 hours in total. The results were mind-blowing. Not only did their performance get better, but they eventually surpassed the scores of 20-year-olds playing the game for the very first time.
But more importantly, this wasn't just about game scores. They showed real-world improvements in things like working memory and sustained attention. And those cognitive gains, they stuck around for 6 months after they stopped playing. Another study even put a number on it. They found that playing 3D video games boosted memory performance by 12%. Now, to put that into perspective, 12% is roughly how much memory performance tends to decline naturally between the ages of 45 and 70. So it's almost like these games turned back the clock on age-related cognitive decline. And the reason 3D games seem to be the magic ticket? It's because navigating these big, complex virtual worlds gives the hippocampus, the brain's memory and mapping center, a serious workout. Okay. So what's the big takeaway here? The science is telling us that video games aren't simply good for you or bad for you. It's just not that simple. What they are is an incredibly powerful tool that can genuinely reshape our brains.
Mark Palaus, who was the lead author on that huge review of over 100 studies, I think he summed it up perfectly. He said we just have to embrace the complexity. We can recognize and even celebrate the benefits for things like attention and motor skills, while at the same time taking the risk of addiction very seriously.
And we've got to remember, this is all brand new science. Researchers are really just beginning to figure out which types of games affect which parts of the brain. But this opens up some incredible future possibilities. Like maybe one day designing specific video games as therapies for things like depression, ADHD, or even to help delay dementia.
So at the end of the day, the evidence is pretty clear. The games we choose to play have the power to fundamentally change the way our brains are wired. The question isn't really if they change us anymore. The real question is, how are we going to choose to use that power?